Hello friends. Glad to see you. Sit back because we're starting to talk about crimes and a lot of interesting things, and here we go.
A sadistic murderer in the United States could not be caught for 40 years. How did he manage to hide? The U.S. police said that the criminal, nicknamed the Golden State Killer, committed at least 12 murders, 45 rapes, and broke into homes across California hundreds of times. This week, the police arrested the man who, in their opinion, committed all this. How did the person who committed all these crimes manage to avoid arrest for 40 years? Warning: the material published below contains details of some of the crimes committed. On the evening of May 3, 1986, Janelle Cruz stayed at home alone. Her parents were on vacation. Taking advantage of this, an 18-year-old girl who worked in a restaurant invited a friend to visit. Later, he recalled that at least twice they noticed strange noises coming from the street and from the garage. But Cruz, who was described by her family as a kind-hearted and beautiful girl just entering adulthood, did not attach much importance to these sounds. Around midnight, her friend left. The next morning, a real estate agent who came to show the house to potential buyers found Janelle in her bedroom. She was raped and beaten to death, her teeth were crushed, and her face was so bloody that it was difficult to recognize her. Traces of tennis shoes were found near the house, and a heavy wrench was missing from the garden behind the house. Initially, the people who were the last to see Cruz alive, as well as her former boyfriends, came under suspicion, but the investigation reached an impasse. At the same time, the police collected biological samples from the crime scene and the victim's body. But at that time the practice of DNA analysis as evidence in criminal cases was in its infancy. The biomaterials were stored for many years, samples from the crime scene and the victim's body, but at that time the practice of DNA analysis as evidence in criminal cases was in its infancy. The biomaterials were stored for many years. The Cruz family tried to live on, but the thought that the killer Janelle was still at large did not give them rest. "I couldn't stay home alone for 32 years, says Michelle Cruz White, Janelle Oppo's younger sister. In 1986, the family had not yet known, but their Janelle was the last known victim of the so-called Golden State Killer. He has been working for almost 10 years and has become known as one of the most terrible sadists in American history. Since the early 1970s, an unknown criminal has been attacking various parts of California, from Sacramento to Los Angeles. He was given various nicknames: the rapist of the eastern areas, the real night hunter, and others, only with the advent of DNA testing. The police realized that they were dealing with the same criminal. But even after that, it took them 2 more decades to find him. This is part of our history. Several generations of investigators have worked on this, said Sergeant Sean Hampton, District Sheriff Oppo's office, Sacramento. Rapist of the Eastern Districts. On July 18, 1976, a masked attacker entered the bedroom of a 23-year-old girl, who woke up to see a man hanging over her, completely naked from the waist down. He tied her hands, stuffed a nightgown into her mouth and raped her. After he left, she managed to dial 911. Although her hands were still tied, she was the very first victim. Over the next 12 months, the man dubbed the rapist of the Eastern Districts attacked his victims over and over again. Sometimes the attacks occurred only a few days apart. Usually, the maniac chose one-story houses, entered them through the windows and tied the victims' hands. He blinded women with bright light and threatened them with death. The attacks have upended a quiet life in Sacramento. The townspeople began to arm themselves with pistols and baseball bats, buy guard dogs and lock doors. For the first time in their lives, the rapist of the Eastern Districts committed increasingly sadistic crimes. He took trophies from his victims, such as jewelry. Before raping a 13-year-old girl, he put plates on the back of her mother, who was in the next room, and threatened her that he would cut off her daughter's fingers if he heard the sound of falling plates. Slightly smiling face. Another woman had a phone call at home, which was recorded. The rapist of the Eastern Districts, investigators believe it was him, repeated the same phrase in a whisper, "I will kill you. I'll kill you, I'll kill you." Katie and Brian Major were murdered in 1978. The perpetrator raped more than 24 women before committing his first murder known to investigators in 1978. Katie and Brian Major were walking their dog on the night of February 2, 1978, when they had a conflict with a stranger. No one knows what they were talking about or why they quarreled. But 20-year-old Katie and 21-year-old Brian were killed by gunfire. Several witnesses saw a man in a ski mask running away, a few months earlier. Katie had complained that a man had been stalking her at work. Her colleagues said that someone was constantly calling her and saying, "It's your turn." A stranger in a blue Volkswagen had been following her for hours. After she tried to approach him, he left, but then returned a few hours later. After that, Katie quit her job. The night hunter, after the murders of Katie and Brian, the rapist from the East, began to carry out attacks in Contra Costa County, where he raped more than 20 people, and then committed murder. This time, his victims were osteopathic surgeon Robert Offerman and his girlfriend Alexandria Manning. Both were tied up and killed at Offerman's house. After this incident, he no longer left his victims alive. In the early 1980s, a criminal known as the Real Night Hunter began killing in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. He developed a new habit. He raped women in front of their partners, and then killed both of them. He killed spouses Lyman and Charlene Smith, newly married Keith and Patty Harrington, as well as Sherry Domino and her boyfriend Greg Sanchez. The Smiths were hammered with a log for the fireplace. He also raped and murdered a woman named Manuela Vidin in 1981 while her husband was in the hospital. In the end, in 1986, he raped and killed Janelle Cruz, after which he disappeared without a trace for 32 years. How did they find the killer? The police were confused by the fact that rapes and murders were sometimes committed hundreds of miles apart. The police suspected the most obvious people, rejected lovers, family members, or other acquaintances of the deceased. "We had excellent detectives who worked hard on this case," says Lieutenant Paul Belly, who has been involved in this case since 2008. According to him, no one could have imagined at that time that the criminal from Southern California would turn out to be the killer everyone was looking for. 10 years after Cruz's murder, it turned out that DNA from her body matched DNA from the bodies of the Harringtons and Vidin. Over time, it turned out that the DNA matched DNA from the murder sites of Domino and Sanchez, as well as the Smiths, and from several rape sites in Contra Costa in the late 1970s. The cops had had the DNA of the Golden State Killer for decades, but they couldn't find a match in the database. This means that this man has never been held accountable. As a result, an operational group was formed from all affected jurisdictions, as well as representatives of the FBI. A reward was offered for information about the killer or this case. Police and journalists received thousands of messages, but the suspect was never found. Everything changed 2 weeks ago. On April 25, Sacramento District Attorney Anna Maria Schubert announced that 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo had been arrested and charged with the murders of the Smiths, Harringtons, and other victims. The night before, rumors of an arrest appeared in the community of the killer's surviving victims and relatives of the victims. The lead detective in the Cruz case called her sister Michelle and their mother to tell them about the news. I cried, says Michelle Cruz White. Her mother was also in shock, she says. The breakthrough in the investigation came after Paul Holes, a retired investigator from the Contra Costa District Attorney's Office who had been involved in the case for a long time, decided to search on the free genealogy site years.Match, where users leave information about themselves. According to the Sacramento Bee newspaper, the site was created so that people could find long-lost relatives. years.Match has a database with 800,000 DNA profiles. Sacramento County Deputy Attorney General Steve Grippy confirmed that one of the D'Angelo family members used the service. "We were looking for a needle in a haystack and found it," Prosecutor Schubert said. She has been involved in the investigation since 2000. Who is Joseph James D'Angelo? D'Angelo is a former police officer who worked in Auburn. He was fired after he was caught shoplifting in 1979. D'Angelo tried to steal a sledgehammer and a dog repellent. He is married, has a daughter, and has worked as a truck repair mechanic at a local grocery store chain for 27 years. After his arrest, the police began searching his house in search of the trophies that the killer had taken away, as well as masks and weapons. D'Angelo made his first court appearance in Sacramento on Friday. He was in a wheelchair, he was wearing an orange prison uniform, and he spoke in a whisper. He asked for a public defender. His next trial is scheduled for May 14th. It is unclear whether the state will ask for the death penalty for him. Meanwhile, the Sacramento County Sheriff urged all victims of sexual assault who did not contact the police in those years to do so now. "This investigation will go on for a very long time," said Sergeant Sean Hampton. At the suspect's house, Michelle Cruz White couldn't contain her emotions in a telephone interview with the BBC. She says she burst into tears for the first time since she learned that her sister's rapist and murderer could face justice. According to her, she was finally able to realize how the incident had affected her life, and the arrest proved that her decision 2 years ago to speak publicly and talk about the murder was the right one. "My family thought that if I became known to the whole world, it would endanger all of us, the whole family would be in danger," she says. "It's such a relief to me that it's all over and my sister can rest in peace." D'Angelo can still try to prove his innocence. Michelle Cruz White says she was able to calm down and relax for the first time in 32 years. "The whole world will know about his secrets. He won't be able to hide and die in peace anymore. We did it. He's where he needs to be."